When they told me I had to speak here, I wasn't quite sure what the topic was. Nobody told me we were discussing different themes, moksha and karma and so forth. So, and I didn't know what to expect, and I have a PhD in theoretical chemistry, and I generally, speak with scientists, philosophers, and I try to present the philosophy of Vedanta, the ontology of Vedanta, to them so that they can get some grasp of what the Vedanta offers as far as understanding their own practices, their own understanding of reality. And so this is going to be a little bit philosophical. Sometimes people think of the Vedas or the Vedic tradition, the Vedanta and so forth, as a system of rituals, polytheism, and what they generally call religion or Hinduism. Of course, Hinduism is a religious concept as they understand it, and so it doesn't really bring out the profound philosophical significance of it in Vedas. And it does have a very profound philosophy behind it, an ontology that it represents. And what I want to do is today is try to show that how that same ontology has manifested in the West through the different Western philosophers, and try to relate the two, so that when I'm speaking to Westerners, specifically even sometimes to Indians who have been exposed to the more Western type of education in the IITs and other universities within India, they get appreciation for their own philosophy through this kind of Western approach. Excuse me. So on slide one I mentioned here, my teachers, Srila Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada, who have most influenced me, and Srila Bhakti-Lokak Siddhardev Goswami, the great souls whom I've had the good fortune of coming in contact with, and who have actually guided me through my spiritual life up to this point, and I hope in the future also. And I wanted to make a point about this quote from Srila Prabhupada, who said, "Consciousness is a symptom of the soul." It was not very clear to me whether, I think there's several people who talk about consciousness as being the soul, but actually consciousness and the soul are distinct. And I wanted to see or show how that distinction comes about and what it means actually. Maybe you can go to the second slide. It was hard to put this into slides, and the talk that I'm going to give is very subtle, or would you say abstract, I guess, even more than subtle. And so to explain these ideas in pictures or simple sentences is a little difficult. And I hope you'll grasp something of what I'm saying, because this is going to be a little very hard to understand, especially if you've never thought about these things before. These are going to seem like very unusual type of ideas. But I start out with whatever may be beyond thought, we cannot think. If there's anything beyond thought, we cannot think it, of course, and we call that achintya. Achintya means inconceivable. It cannot be thought even. So, but for philosophy, we start with thinking, because philosophy is dealing with thinking. What does thinking produce for us? And the type of thinking that we're interested in is not ordinary thinking. This is called pure thinking. And I associate this with the Sanskrit Vishuddha-sattva, the platform of Vishuddha-sattva. Of course, Vishuddha-sattva is a very extensive platform, but it's the idea of pure thinking or purity that's uncontaminated, unpolluted with empirical or any subjective or any egotistic, egoic reference. What you what you might call moksha. Moksha means freedom from all empirical, subjective, and egoic reference. If there is such a thought, that is what we mean by pure thought. And according to the Western philosophers that I've already mentioned, that state of reality does exist, and actually that is the plane of the absolute truth, what we might call Brahman. Then we'll start with Aristotle. Aristotle was probably the most influential philosopher in the Western world, other than Plato, who was his teacher actually. Plato and Aristotle. Aristotle's ideas influenced the world for 2 millennia, up to the present time almost. Of course, at the time of Galileo and Newton, they began challenging some of the things that Aristotle had taught. But basically, he had influenced the whole world up until that point. So he was had some very powerful ideas, profound ideas, that people found very convincing and helped to guide them, helped to guide Western civilization up to that point. And even today, the understanding of Aristotle's theories, you like it really loud in here, I think. I have a very soft voice, but they were so influential that they maintained their validity over thousands of years, 2,000 years at least. Anyhow, what he thought the ultimate basis of everything else was what he called noesis, noesios, noesis in Greek. Noesis, noesios, noesis means thought, thinking, thought. Now, this thought is not, like I said, not the ordinary thoughts we have, but this is the pure thought. Thought without any reference to empirical or subjective thought or to egoic thought. This pure thought. What kind of thought would that be? I'm going to mention in a minute, but Hegel also, George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. He was a philosopher, a German philosopher. He lived about from 1770 to 1831. He also understood the absolute to be this thought, thinking thought, just as Aristotle did. And actually he was considered something like a reincarnation of Aristotle, because his philosophy was so much derived from from Aristotle's philosophy, that he was like a revivalist of Aristotelian thought. Anyhow, he understood thought to be that which produces its own product. Thinking is what produces itself as thought. That's the only function of thinking. Thinking is to produce itself. And this he felt, and from this idea, he developed an entire encyclopedia of the categories of reality. I don't know if any of you are familiar with his work, but it's quite amazing. Just as Aristotle covered so many different topics in his philosophy, similarly, Hegel did the same thing, but in a more systematic way than Aristotle ever dreamed of. And so he wrote what he called the science of logic. And he defined this absolute plane of thinking thought as spirit. In fact, he said that substance is subject. Substance must be understood as subject, and not merely as subject. A substance, right? Not merely a substance, not merely a subject, but substance that is just as much subject as it is substance. Because this is what we mean by thinking. Thinking is a plane of being. In fact, being and thinking are not different from one another, believe it or not. If you are seeking that ultimate platform from which everything else is derived, then it must be, because being is part of all reality, everything that is. So, and if that plane is thinking, then we have thinking that is identified with the plane of being. You understand? The absolute is thinking, that absolute must be also. So that thinking plane is the being plane of being. Being not in the sense of being this podium, or the stage or being of these bodies or being of the world. That's not the being we're talking about. We're talking about pure being. Pure being means universal thought of being. The idea of being. That's what we mean by pure being. It's not the being of something. It's that being that is so pure that it can associate with anything whatsoever. It can give itself and become the being of other things. Otherwise, if we talk about a particular being, then, like say, the being of the door back there, that can't be applied to the being of the stage or the being of anything else. That's only a particular type of being. So we have to talk about being pure and simple in itself. And when we get that conception of being, which is thought, being is a thought, first of all, but also thought is being. Anyhow, when we can catch this idea, then we can understand that being itself has no being. It has no substantiality because it's a universal. You know the difference between the universal and things that are not universal, or particular or individual. There are generally three types of, three phases of a concept. The universality, the particularity, and their individuality. And just like if I say mammal, a mammal is a genus, huh? And then under mammal we'll find different species. Let's say cows or human beings even. Whatever has mammary glands we call mammals. And then under the species, there's genus, then there's species, and then there's the specimen, the individual thing. Right? So genus is a universal. We don't see mammal in general. We see different instantiations of mammal. Different species and then different specimens of mammals. But mammal itself is a category. So this kind of being as that category, as that universal, is what we mean by being. And that has no being. It doesn't have a being like this podium. Because the being is, although the being is in here, being itself doesn't have being. So this being that has no being is being that is non-being. Being and non-being, or nothing, are therefore the same. That pure being, that universal being, that has no being, is the same as non-being. And one Greek philosopher, his name was Heraclitus, he had this idea, that being is the same as non-being. Being, he said, being no more is the non-being. And it's a fact, because it's a universal. Non-being has the same quality as being, and being has the same quality as non-being. So being and nothing are the same in the realm of pure thought. And this is true of everything that is contradictory related or oppositionally related in the realm of pure thought. Finite and infinite, subject and object, and so forth. This is the plane that we might call Advaita, of oneness. Of all differences are one in that plane. But because it's a plane of thoughts, every thought is different from the other. And therefore there's also difference in that plane. There's oneness, that they're all thought, and even the contradictions are identical with one another, but they're different in that there are different thoughts. So this plane of oneness and difference is what we mean by this absolute truth, or Brahman. It's a plane of oneness and difference. And this idea was taught by Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. Sri Krishna Chaitanya, about 500 years ago, he came to teach this philosophy of what he called Achintya Veda Veda Tattva. You were speaking about a synthesis of the three schools of philosophy, three sampradayas of Brahma, of Madhava, Ramanuja, and Shankar. Mahaprabhu wanted to synthesize these also, and to create a more, to remove what you might call defects in each of them, and bring it to a more rational and satisfying ideology for the modern world. I don't know if you've ever looked into Mahaprabhu's teachings, but there you'll find many of the things you're talking about are represented, even so far as the progress of the from the plane of Brahman to Vaikuntha, and then even higher than that to Goloka. Is all found in his teachings. Anyhow, this idea that of the thinking itself is the idea of the absolute truth that Hegel and Aristotle and Heraclitus especially, they all thought was the ultimate meaning of things is found there. So, this identity of being and nothing is a very interesting idea. Generally, if we think of being and nothing, we imagine that if they're kept in separate chambers, as it is, not interacting with one another, then they remain stable. They retain their stable identities. But if we ever brought them together, what do you think would happen? If being and nothing were brought together, they would disappear. Right? Nothing would just annihilate being. If they touch. Sometimes this idea of the vanishing of being and nothing was led to the ancient Buddhist idea that they also understood in the most ancient days of Greek philosophy, say about 500 BC, that Parmenides understood everything was being, this pure being that we're talking about, and Heraclitus had this concept of the non-being of being. And like that, these thoughts were going on at that time, and there were also the skeptics who thought that if this is the case, that being and non-being when brought together would actually annihilate each other, then this must be the ultimate reality, that there is nothing. And the Buddhists called that sunyata, sunyavad. That there is no being, there is no nothing, there is no thinking, there is nothing. You can't even say nothing, there's no nothing. Okay? That was the idea of sunyavad. So it came from this debate they had, even in those most ancient days, about the ultimate reality being based on being and nothing. It's the most simple ideas. Right? Anyhow, Heraclitus had a different idea. He said when being and nothing come together, they annihilate, yes, they vanish, but that doesn't mean that there is nothing. Because the vanishing of being into nothing is a process. Something is happening there. Not only that, but the vanishing of nothing into being is also a process. It goes both ways. There's a synergy. Being goes into nothing, nothing goes into being. And we can distinguish these two processes. One is called ceasing to be. Being going into nothing is called ceasing to be. And nothing going into being is called coming to be. So we have ceasing to be and coming to be. Now these two ideas, if we combine them together, if we unite ceasing to be with coming to be, what do we have? Do we have nothing? We have what they call becoming. From being and nothing, ceasing to be and coming to be, this is what we mean by nothing. The unity of these two things. When a rose is growing, you start with a seed. There's the nothing of the plant in the seed. The being of the seed is the nothing of the plant. And when the stem grows, the nothing of the seed is the being of the stem. And when the stem forms a bud, the bud is the nothing of the stem and the being of the bud. And when the bud blooms, the rose is the nothing of the bud and the being of the flower. And when the flower dies, the nothing of the flower is the seed of the rose. Again, the cycle begins. So this is the becoming or growing. We observe becoming in the fact of growth within nature. And at every point in that becoming of the rose or growing of the rose, at every point there's the being and nothing identity. The nothing and being at every point, instantaneously. So he had that idea, a very brilliant conception, and quite contrary to the Buddhist skeptic idea. of the absolute nothingness of the beginning. Then we also have, much later, Descartes, René Descartes, a French philosopher. And he came up with this cogito ergo sum, in which, again, he identified cogito with sum. Cogito means thinking, and sum means being. So he also understood that his identity was not something empirical, but it was something that was found there in thought. His identity was located within thought. That being of thought was his being, his ego. Of course, it was a little premature to say his ego was in thought because ego had not been yet derived from thinking. Pure thinking without having any development doesn't give rise to ego just like that. Ego is a development from pure thinking, but we have to see how that comes about. And that's something that I want to discuss also today. So, the first thought is being. All right, we have a way to go before we get to slide 3. The first thought is being. Then if thinking is an activity, and the thought is a product of that activity, then we make a distinction. We seem to be able to make a distinction between the thinking activity and the product of that activity. The thinking and the thought. So the first thought is being, then the thinking of that being would be the second thought. But what do we mean by the thinking of being? Actually, this is not a precise way of dealing with this problem, because the thought and the thinking activity are not really different. But of course, people get confused when they discuss these things, philosophers and even or anyone. There is a difference between thinking and thought as an activity and as a product. But because the product is there in the activity also, they're not different. There's a similarity. Just like in breathing is an activity. But if the product of breathing is a breath, then certainly breath and breathing are not different from one another. Breathing is just a series of breaths, right? So to say a distinction is between breathing and breath is a little bit chancy. And the same way thinking and thought have an identity in difference. But anyhow, we take the difference. Then we have thinking that's devoid of being, and being that's devoid of thinking, right? So I think I mentioned that here. No, all right, well, you could start there, no problem. Thinking that's devoid of being, and being that's devoid of thinking. So we have a separation here. Thinking and without being, and being without thinking. Now this is Descartes' philosophy here already. Descartes said there's a separation or duality, right? Between res cogitos and res extensus. Res extensus means extended being, and res cogitos means thinking substance. He divided these two, and this is what we generally call subject and object. The object is the being without thinking, and the subject is the thinking without being. Thinking means something is going on, we don't know where and what it is. And being is something that is substantial and has, extension in this world, or occupied space. Of course, that's an empirical conception of being, and also an empirical conception of thinking. Because thinking is not subjective. Thinking is not subjective, it's absolute. And being is not empirical, it is also pure, abstract. So here we get the concept of subject and object appearing at pure thinking. And this subject-object relationship is the actual structure of consciousness. Consciousness is a subject-object relationship. It has that structure within it. So consciousness is actually coming out of this absolute. It's produced from it. It's not there. We don't start with consciousness. It's something that is produced by thinking. So this is I guess it's very hard to say all in a half an hour, so I have to sum up here now. And probably you're all falling half asleep anyhow. So. Let's see. Slide forward. Slide forward. Hegel's phenomenology of spirit, with much of this is described, and also his science of logic. He has it. Anyone who's interested in these topics is a great author to read. In summary, now, I said here something like, pure thinking I mentioned was Vishuddha Sattva, and that's the plane of the Atma or Brahman, and spirit. And it's also thinking itself, according to Aristotle, was theos. Theos means God in the Greek. So God is that pure thinking being. That means that God is not impersonal. He's not merely a substance, but he's also a subject. Only subjects think. And anything where there is thinking, there is a subject or a person. Then we mentioned that plane is characterized by the identity of identity and difference, Achintya Beta Beta Tattva, which was the teaching of Mahaprabhu, and that consciousness is later development. And ego, what is ego? Well, ego, if there is consciousness knows its object, and its object is therefore determined by the consciousness. Whatever we know of the object is what our consciousness makes of it. So consciousness can see its own manifestation in the object, such that the object and the consciousness are merely two sides of the same coin. They're one thing. One is consciousness, one is subject, one is object. But ultimately they are the thinking, that same thinking of thinking. See, so they are actually one. By consciousness of consciousness, the object becomes the same as the consciousness that is reflecting it. Then that consciousness of consciousness becomes what we call self-consciousness. Self-consciousness is what we mean by ego. And that ego, when it becomes as a one, an ego that is simply identical with itself, has no content. And so it again has to split itself into two, and it makes itself and the world. Makes itself and the world. So this ego, in that sense, that is opposing itself to a world, is called ahankar. That's what we mean by the ahankar. And because these are all happening outside of the thinking, pure thinking of thinking, and into the empirical world, we explain that the Atma would be the pure thinking of itself, and the consciousness is something that is generated from that and is related to that in an external way. And then I mentioned here, consciousness may be explained as chitta in Sanskrit. And the reason, now I didn't mention the difference between reason and understanding because we'd have to go back to the other things where being and nothing are dissolved in one another, but they also have a relationship to one another. Being is what would you say? Being is not nothing, and nothing is not being. So they're related to one another, even though they're opposites. This is called negatively related. And this relationship forms a union, like we mentioned, of becoming. Becoming is the unity of this relationship between being and nothing. So the dissolution of being into nothing, that is called dialectic. First of all, the isolation of them is called understanding. The dissolution of them is called dialectic. And then the internal unity that they both have with one another, that's called reason. So reason is called buddhi in Sanskrit and the Samkhya philosophy, and understanding is manas or mind. Then understanding is what determines singular objects. This is the basic mode of thinking of the scientists. Scientists look at everything and they try to analyze it, strip it down into individual things, and separate, fixed things, just like atoms. Atoms are fixed identities. They don't change. Once you have an atom, it doesn't change. Of course, there are atomic reactions, so forth and so on, but basically, in most of the applications in physics that we normally use in chemistry and whatnot, the atoms maintain their identities, and they enter into combination with things, but they don't really change themselves. This is the plane of understanding. If changes occurred between atoms and what they were atoms of, if we could relate these two sides, the unity and the diversity together, then we would have a dialectic relationship. And to understand that in an integral way, systematic way, that would be reason in a conceptual way. Just like we were mentioning before about being nothing and becoming. Becoming is the concept of being and nothing. So there we have reason determines the concepts. Basically, there's a difference between reason, dialectic, understanding, And then the absolute, I was trying to put all these into one overall conversation here. I don't know how much I succeeded. And we can go to the next slide real quick. Dr. Viewer, there's another way of understanding things, and then this is you can just pass that by. And then this is where we're located in Princeton. Thank you very much. I hope I didn't confuse you.